Well, it was in the days of good King Freddie. England had been at war and in turmoil for many years. If it wasn't trouble on Hadrian's Wall with King Duncan's backdipping barbarians, it was rotten old Pierre, King of France, challenging England to another round of Who Quits Aquitaine. Freddie was at his wits' end, and when he reached that condition, which was rather often, he called for his Prime Minister, Merlin the Whirlin. Now Merlin was not only the wisest man in England. He had won the gold medal in last year's Pan Christendom Clever Clogs contest, and he wore the medal probably on his fur coat, just in case Freddie should forget. Merlin always wore a fur coat that reached right down to the floor, which wasn't very far because in an age in which all men were more like dwarfs than Messiah, Merlin was still shorter than most. To compensate for this lack or cranial altitude, Merlin always wore a long pointed hat, the tip of which rose higher than Freddie's crown, which was another reason why Freddie didn't really like him very much. Being so wise, Merlin was fully cognizant of this fact, but he also knew that Freddie, who couldn't even read, couldn't run the country without him. So he took his time in walking to Freddie's castle. Freddie was growing more and more impatient. "Where is that wretched midget?" he asked the servant, who brought him his afternoon cup of goat's milk. "He says it's his short legs that make him walk so slowly, but I know he does it on purpose." "I'm sure he comes as fast as he can," replied the servant, always trying to smooth things out between the two men who could sack him at a second's notice. "He has a lot on his mind." "He'd have a lot less if he got rid of that stupid hat," growled the king. "What was that you were saying?" asked Merlin, coming into the royal presence and pretending to be out of breath. "I was just remarking to my good man here that I always have to share my goat's milk with that stupid cat," said Freddie, pointing to his Persian blue tomcat, Alexander, who slunk away in disgrace. Alexander wasn't really a Persian blue. His mother was a feral alley cat who chased rats in the castle dungeons, but after Freddie found out that prisoners in the dungeons didn't like rats, he took away the cats to be his pets upstairs. He told everyone that Alexander was a Persian blue, a gift from the Shah of Persia, just to make the French ambassador jealous, but that's another story. "What's the trouble today?" asked Merlin. "Has Pierre issued another ultimatum? Do you want me to read it to you?" Merlin always liked to remind Freddie that he couldn't read. "Is it in English or in French?" "No, it's not Pierre this time," replied Freddie, trying to think of a witty riposte to Merlin's taunt. "Nor Duncan really, although they're both being as beastly as usual. It's the plague of monsters." "Yes, I've heard that Saint Cuthbert is having more trouble than usual," said Merlin, anxious to remind his monarch that monsters were not directly the concern of the Prime Minister, but of the patron saint and Minister for the Environment. "Do you think that Cuthbert is really up to the job these days? He's getting on in years. Perhaps we should retire him." "Well, he certainly slipped up over dealing with that little fellow that Duncan's mod fished out of Loch Ness," replied Merlin. "He said it went berserk because the Scots tried to feed it on haggis and salty porridge." "Ah yes," said Freddie, "we nearly had to revoke the ban on the blowing of bagpipes in the demilitarized zone." At this merry recollection, the king laughed so much that Merlin thought he might fall off his throne. He stepped sideways just in time to avoid being knocked over by the burly stabilizers, who rushed forward to ensure that the dignity of the sovereign was not compromised. "Then, there was that silly business down in Somerset when they drained Blagden Reservoir," said Merlin. "Those weren't Welsh dragons. I don't care what Cuthbert says." "Well, if our patron saint can't tell a Welsh dragon from an Irish what's-it, he must be getting past it. Is it time to sack the fellow and recruit a new minister for the environment?" "Hold on," said Merlin. "Has a complete review of Cuthbert's performance been undertaken over the past 12 months? You can't sack a man without a fully documented appraisal." Merlin always insisted on following written procedures, because then the king's illiteracy guaranteed his own job tenure. "Take a look at that," said Freddie, angrily throwing Merlin a parchment scroll that narrowly missed knocking off his pointed hat. "What's this?" exclaimed Merlin. "You let Cuthbert borrow the finest stallion in your royal stables?" "I'm afraid so." He insisted. Said he couldn't guarantee to catch a Hungarian Wagalog without it. A Hungarian Wagalog? Heaven forbid. We haven't got one of those running around in England, have we? Exclaimed Merlin, pulling on his long white beard. Cuthbert seems to think so. He borrowed my best lance and sword from the Royal Armoury as well. Were the loan documents properly drafted and signed? No, he just took them and galloped off over the drawbridge, heading for Tunbridge Wells. Then we can sack him for not following proper procedures, said Merlin with a big grin. Whom do we appoint in his place? Asked the king. That's the problem, said Merlin. Who else is there who could do the job?